Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the golden age of Athens. And actually we're going to talk about all the ancient Greeks. This is part one of the ancient Greeks. This picture right here is from the golden age of Athens. And this is Pericles giving the funeral oration. And he's speaking like on the Pnyx Hill before the Acropolis, the great hill with all the famous buildings like the Parthenon, the temple to Athena, and all the great Greek architecture and whatnot in Athens. Okay, and Pericles was the leading statesman of Athens at that time. He's talking about the funeral oration and celebrating the great deeds of other Greek men. And ancient Greeks are the pinnacle of ancient civilization. The ancient Romans stink compared to the ancient Greeks. All of the other civilizations of the world compared to the ancient Greeks of that time were either evil or boring. The ancient Greeks started most of what we would consider good in the ancient world. They started the philosophy. They had Pythagoras, the first vegetarian, used to be called the Pythagorean diet. Theater, their literature, they just had a lot of fun. Their art, they were good at painting, even though we don't have most of their paintings. They were really good at sculpture. You're going to see the more you study the ancient Greeks, the more you like them. I'll show you some more slides. Just wanted to open with Pericles giving a speech before the Acropolis. Now the next slide is Pericles' girlfriend. This is his girlfriend, Aspasia. And what I like about ancient Greece too is if you had to ask yourself, if I was sent back to ancient Greece, to the ancient world, where would I want to go? And I would tell you the only place I would go if I had a choice would be ancient Greece. Look how beautiful this is, how beautiful the Acropolis is, the great Greek buildings, downtown Athens on a hill. You're right by the ocean, the rolling hills, there's pastoral fields. It's beautiful. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some bad things about ancient Greece too. They did have slaves, okay? All ancient societies had slaves. All of them, other than the ancient Greeks, for the most part, tended to be some brutal ruler, tyrant, despot who just beats the crap out of everybody and forces them to obey and do their slave labor and whatnot. In ancient Greece, at least you had a big aristocracy where they had freedom and education and free speech, debate, democracy, all kinds of good things. Okay, and I mean democracy in the old sense, not in the modern sense, where it's not really democracy. Okay, so anyways, and they also had a situation with the women. The women to be housewives, they didn't send them for education. They sort of just had them focus on home domestic duties. The courtesans, which could be girlfriends, the aristocrat might have a wife for having kids with, and then a courtesan, these are more educated women that could be girlfriends that they would talk to more. Okay, and Aspasia in particular was pretty interesting. She was a non-Athenian, very educated, very smart lady. This right here is Dream of Arcadia by Thomas Cole. He's a great painter, the greatest painter of the Hudson River School. Came to the USA in the 1800s. He's the guy who made the Course of Empire, magnificent series of paintings that embody, the work of Giambattista Vico and whatnot. And he also made the wonderful series of paintings, probably the best series of stories paintings ever made, called The Voyage of Life. That's Thomas Cole. Well, anyways, he had this idea that the world was becoming too industrialized, and there was an old Dream of Arcadia written about on a Grecian urn when they talked about the pleasant pastoral paradise idea of rural bliss. And he just sort of made this painting, and you can see, the Greek architecture up there, the big hills, and there's this sense with ancient Greece, this idea of dreaming and pleasure and wonderful life. It all goes with ancient Greece. And a lot of also the two foundational lines of modern Christianity, they go from ancient Greeks. People say the Old Testament, Old Testament, Old Testament. Ancient Greece had a major influence on the Christian religion. Major. Okay? First of all, I'll just mention there is the Plato, kind of a mystic philosopher, carrying over into the works of St. Augustine, carrying over into the Augustinian monk Luther, and the Protestants. So I'm not that big a fan of that way of thinking, but just so you know, that is a major stream of Christian thought. The other stream of Christian thought is the one that I think is by far the best. That is Aristotelian, Aristotle, leading into Thomas Aquinas, leading into the Italian Renaissance and what came from that. Aristotle's the greatest. He's the greatest philosopher who ever lived, and he sort of wanted to be logical and fair and reasonable and to categorize all the useful information of the time of his age with this respect for meritocracy and excellence and individual effort. Okay, so next painting here is, I don't know the painter of it, but this is just Acropolis downtown. You could imagine yourself walking around in downtown Athens, going to the store, stopping by, you know, the different buildings over there. They probably had a bookstore. I mean, well, you know, they didn't have regular books. But what I'm trying to say is the place was so educated. There were so many schools, a lot of people reading. It's the only place in the ancient world where I can imagine myself not hating it. I would like a lot of things in ancient Greece. If I spoke ancient Greek and I could talk to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and a lot of the other interesting characters of that time. A lot of people have written that it's the most interesting phase ever in the history of the world, the great golden age of Athens. Okay, here's Thespis. He was the first actor. That's where the word thespian, an actor, comes from. He was, I think, from around 500 BC. There initially was only one actor in their plays. The Greeks are famous for writing the best plays ever. There was only one actor, and then later they put a whole theater production. He would just change masks when he would speak in the lines of a different character. Here's one drawing by Glendoni from the 1800s called The Birds from one of Aristophanes' plays. Aristophanes was sort of the comedic playwright. The other real famous playwrights, of course, were Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. And Plato had wanted to be a playwright, but he was a failure as a playwright. Okay, he had wanted to be a politician. He was a failure as a politician. So then he became a philosopher, and he combined what he had learned about writing plays and politics into his philosophy, like when he wrote The Great Republic. And so he wrote in the form of a play such that there was a big dialogue between several different characters, and he typically would have Socrates as the hero. His idea of Socrates as a new type of hero, the new man, the intellectual man, not just a strong guy like Achilles or a sneaky guy like Odysseus. From the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Idiot and the Oddity. The Greek theaters, they would build them into a side of a hill, which gave them great acoustics. You can see they could fill relatively large stadiums just speaking with their voice, with no electronics. And they were able to communicate that loud enough and effectively. The Greeks had great statues. If you look at the statues of other primitive cultures, you'll see that they stink. You know, there'll be a fat fertility female goddess, look like it was made by a kid, or there'll be this, you know, no expression, robotic-like, primitive-looking statues coming out of Egypt. But the Greeks made the first lifelike, magnificent statues, and they're kind of beautiful. And you get this idea they're having a good time. The Greeks had the Olympic Games. Okay, they had competitions in theater, the Dionysia. Okay, here's a quote from Edith Hamilton, scholar of ancient Greek, author of The Greek Way. She became an honorary citizen of Athens. She said, "The Greeks played. They had games like the Olympic Games. The Romans did not play. Gladiator fights meant death. Gladiator fights were not play." Yeah, the Romans were brutal. The Romans are sort of more Eastern, more brutal and primitive and thuggish. Don't get me wrong, there's some great Romans like Cicero. But in general, when you think of Rome, think of just brutality. Think of uncontrolled emperors. There were a few good emperors, not that many. Anyways, Discobolus, the disco thrower, and this is, you know, a Roman copy of the original Greek. Most of their original Greek stuff got, you know, broken up or destroyed, but the Romans were so impressed by the Greeks, they tried to copy everything the Greeks did. The Greeks were so much smarter than the Romans. And there's a lot of these beautiful statues that are lifelike. You can see the individual faces, their anatomical detail is exquisite, it's great. Here's just another painting of Aspasia talking with the philosophers. So just the fact that this would occur, that, you know, a woman would be having conversations with a bunch of philosophers, mathematicians, and scholars, you know, that's ancient Greece. Other places, you know, they even had the woman less freedom by far than ancient Greece, okay? So she was sort of the philosopher queen to Pericles, the, you know, Democrat guy, but still kind of like the king of Athens of the golden age in those days. Okay, here's another painting of Pericles, and so here's Pericles right here with the helmet on. Here is Aspasia having a conversation with Socrates. So that's kind of how it was. You know, the Pericles was friends with Socrates, sort of thought to be the smartest man in Athens. And that's kind of nice that smart people are talking to each other versus in, you know, modern society, they don't speak to each other. They're not allowed to speak to each other. Okay. So anyways, that's the end of part 1. I hope you enjoyed that. I got a whole bunch more stuff on the ancient Greeks.